Welcome in to a Monday edition of the Wolverine podcast here on the Wolverine.com YouTube channel. If you're watching on Monday night or in our video player on the website, Anthony Broom here with Clayton Safety, two-man booth here today. A lot to get to. We will continue a bit of our positional rundown series. We're going to talk some offensive line and tight ends today. Take your questions at the end of the show, as we always do. And really just talk football here as we're now into the month of July, which is kind of crazy to think about. I believe it's 61 days until the 2024 season kicks off between Michigan and Fresno State. Clayton, welcome in.
Yeah, great to be here. 61 days. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be a great week, I'm sure, for people in the state of Michigan. And a reminder, we will still have a pod on Thursday, so should be pretty good there. And keep it rolling. So hope everyone's having a great week.
Train does not stop around here. It's always full speed or nothing at the Wolverine. Full speed. There is no nothing. That's not even an option for us. We are brought to you today by the Wolverines football preview magazine. We've finished production on that. It's been sent off to the printer, and we're told should maybe, hopefully, start showing up in the wild sometime next week. So that'll be a lot of fun to get in your mailbox finally. Head on over to the WolverineOnDemand.com. Get your copy of what is 160 action-packed pages. Now, listen, I'm not going to disparage some of the other national previews, some of the other preview magazines out there. They do great work. It's a lot of information, but this is, for what I believe my money is worth, the best one out there, given that it's 160 pages of all Michigan. You're going to get your season preview. You're going to get position-by-position looks at the team. We got feature articles. We've got roundtables with national experts in there. We got predictions. We're planting the flag on a lot of things in this issue, and it will be, for those of you that have pre-ordered, it will mail out here shortly. And if you haven't pre-ordered, head on over to the WolverineOnDemand.com. Get your copy today. Plenty available in stock, and really excited to see those start winding up in the wild. So WolverineOnDemand.com, Michigan football preview. Get yours today. We're also brought to you today by ourselves over at thewolverine.com. Use the promo code UM1 to get 2 months of premium access over at our site, which includes access to the message board. A lot of stuff going on in the recruiting world that our crack team of experts are handling on a daily basis. So use that promo code UM1 for 2 months of access for only $1. All right, Clayton. Well, we're going to move into really this will be a wrap up of our offensive position by position rundown today. And because we're combining two position groups, I wanted to narrow it down a little bit. Starting with the offensive line, I think that I want the conversation today to kind of revolve around who either will start or is in legitimate contention to start, because there are a lot of guys there, a lot of names there. We will start with that offensive line, which, one of the big narratives coming into this season is that they will replace all 5 starters from last year. Which is on most teams in most programs, probably something that you'd be a little worried about. And I think if you're a Michigan fan that's concerned about the offensive line, I think it's fair to be to a certain extent just because of the unknown. Right now in July 1, 2024, question marks, not necessarily concerns at this point, but this offensive line from left to right is getting a complete overhaul. And let's start at tackle, Clayton. If the season were to start today, I think most predictions, most prognosticators would have Miles Hinton at left tackle, Andrew Gentry at right tackle. A couple guys kind of maybe lingering behind the scenes in terms of, Jeff Percy's been here for a bit. Tristan Bounds has been here for a bit. I know they're high on Evan Link. That's a guy that maybe a year or so down the road is in contention. Connor Jones entering his junior season in Ann Arbor as well. Blake Frazier comes in as a true freshman, went through through spring football, I should say. But really the bulk of this conversation revolves around Miles Hinton, Andrew Gentry. And I want to start with Miles Hinton first, because this is a guy where, again, we talk about players that look intimidating getting off the bus or walking out to the field in pads. And when it comes to an offensive lineman, he looks like a guy that has come off the offensive line conveyor belt, right? Like he's 6'7", 340, moves really well at the position. But we got a glimpse of him last year, whether it was injury, whether it was inconsistency, a guy that the narrative about him is, oh, well, gosh, if he can put it all together, we think he's a future first-round pick. But to me, I have question marks there in terms of while the body type is intriguing, we're 5 years into a college career, and it's still a pretty decent question mark in terms of what he can bring to the table. So, thoughts on him?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to like, but there are also, a decent amount of question marks. Like you said, I mean, he's a fifth-year senior, but at the same time, and he, wasn't good enough to go to the NFL last year. He lost his starting job. He also battled injury, I think, which is worth noting last season. But at the same time, he has started a significant amount of games in college football. He did win a starting job to begin last season at right tackle over, some guys that ended up being pretty good players. Ladarius Henderson then, was started the year on the bench. Then he moved over to the left. Carson Barnhart slides over to the right side. I think that was a pretty ideal setup. He also beat out Trente Jones, who ended up starting the year at right tackle after Zach Zinter got hurt and Carson Barnhart moved down to right guard. So, it's pretty impressive that he was able to do that when he was healthy coming out of fall camp. At the same time, he didn't perform all that well in some of those games, and he did get passed over. So it's do I expect him to be a first round pick? No. Do I think he could be pretty darn good, an all Big Ten type of player? Absolutely. But I don't know that I would bet on that at this point just because I haven't seen it. But I will say, like, he has experience. There are other guys on this offensive line with starting experience. Giovanni Alhadi has started 2 or 3 games. Jeff Percy has started a game in the past. Josh Preeb has started numerous games at Northwestern. So, it's not like it is an overhaul because you lose your top 6 offensive linemen, but it's not like there aren't guys there or something. Yeah, that haven't played significant snaps in college football. Stanford isn't the Big Ten, in terms of level of competition. And I do think that when it comes to line play, the Big Ten is much stronger and is kind of a step up. But, he has played, some big time college football in the past, did it at Michigan last year, won a job. So I think that the left tackle spot to me is pretty concerning, but there's also potential for it to be pretty darn good.
Yeah, I think something worth mentioning with him too is the fact that there was, like you said, the injury, had to do a lot of extra summer work too, because for some reason, Stanford's credits weren't good enough from a biology department perspective at the University of Michigan, which that continues to kind of be maddening when it comes to the admission side of things. So there's kind of a lot on his plate, and heated competition, and again, that's the cream always rises to the top, right? So I'm not going to make excuses for him, but there were some things going on in the lead up to last year where I think it was a lot, and now by all accounts, I think he showed up to spring ball in really good shape. Sounds like he had a good spring. Sounds like there is that confidence that he can be one of their best 5, and we'll see where it goes with him. But assuming that he's the guy at left tackle, right tackle wise, will kind of be a bit of a fresh face, so to speak, in. I would say it's likely that it's Andrew Gentry. I don't want to plant flags on starting lineups on July 1st, but Andrew Gentry to me feels like the guy that I'll stop short of saying he's a shoo-in for the job, but feels kind of like Andrew Stuber-esque. They had him work inside at guard a bit last year. I think he certainly, when you roll out a lineup of your best 5 guys, I think whatever iteration that takes, he's going to be in it. And it seems like he's going to be one of those guys, likely at right tackle. And, with him, obviously it took a couple of years. He was on a 2-year Mormon mission, didn't enroll until I think it was prior to the 22 season. That sounds right to me. So you have to physically get yourself back in shape, get yourself back in, the football mold, so to speak. And, I think at worst, he's a guy that could be pretty versatile for you. But, everything we've heard about him is that this seems like a guy that is probably pretty firmly in that group of 5, in whatever shape that takes.
Yeah, it's hard to say because I think fall camp is going to be so big for some of these position battles, and Jeff Percy is probably in contention too. And I don't think it would shock if he won the job, but it seems like coming out of spring, Andrew Gentry had the lead, because he played right tackle. started for his team in the spring game. Jeff Percy actually played guard, and I know some of that could have to do with the teams just being drafted that certain way and whatever their head coach or coaching staff on that team deciding for that game. But you would think that if he was coming out of spring as the starter at right tackle, they would have figured out a way to put him at right tackle in the spring game. So that was a tea leaf to me that made me believe it was Andrew Gentry. I mean, this is a massive dude. Like you said, it took him a while maybe to get back into football shape after a 2-year mission, but he was a really highly rated top 100 4-star recruit back in the class of 2020, takes the 2-year mission. Bronco Mendenhall leaves from Virginia. He decides to get out of his letter of intent, calls Jim Harbaugh, and the rest was history. They're like, of course we'd like to have you. And he's going to turn, 23 in the middle of this season, or 24 in the middle of this season. So he's a guy that if he's your starter at right tackle the next 3 years, he could be into his late mid-20s, if that's a thing, 25, 26. And we're talking about somebody that's a massive individual, very strong, is going to be physically mature, knows the system by now. I mean, this could be a really, really good future here at right tackle or wherever you decide to play him for Michigan.
Yeah, it feels like right tackle. Again, you just look at the body type. You look at some of the things that they've prepped him to do. I know that guard, and that's an interesting point with Percy too. A guy that started a game at left tackle a couple of years ago, got him some reps at guard. It seems like, they were doing this under Sharon Moore. And certainly it's going to be something that carries over under Grant Newsome, is that they want these guys to be able to play multiple spots, because it does give you a better opportunity to kind of just put your best 5 out there, as opposed to pigeonholing a guy here and moving him around in that respect. So just in terms of the tackles, I mean, you've talked about Jeff Percy. It feels like what they have behind them is a lot of youth or a lot of inexperience from there. So I don't necessarily know what the rest of that battle is going to look like, but would you say it probably revolves around those 3 guys? Because I that's how I feel when it comes to actual legitimate competition for this season.
Yeah, I would say so. Tristan Bounds is kind of an interesting guy that is a senior that hasn't really played. Like, I don't think he took a snap last season, but has been around. I think he was a 4-star recruit coming out of high school. But I think that sometimes that offensive line guys kind of just get lost in the shuffle and maybe don't develop as planned. As long as you have 7 or 8 guys that you feel like you can trust to go in the game, then I think you should be fine. So it doesn't seem like he has ever really pushed for significant playing time. Evan Link, probably on the left side, feels like the future for Michigan at left tackle. I mean, Blake Frazier, I know Sharon Moore and Grant Newsome talked him up during spring practices, but he's a guy that just enrolled in January. So it'd be somewhat surprising to see him, play early for Michigan unless there were significant injuries, but it definitely seems like he impressed early on. So yeah, I'd say it's probably those 3. And, there's a reason why Miles Hinton decided to come back to Michigan for his 5th season of college football. 1, I don't believe he has his degree yet, but 2, he said he wanted the opportunity to start and be the guy on an offensive line that is successful and is well coached and, you have the opportunity to develop on. And, he spent a year at Michigan, loved it, decided to come back. But I think he's clearly the guy. And I think that Gentry, Percy are the other 2. And then it's kind of, some guys developing beyond them. But probably Evan Link is the 4th guy if I had to guess.
I would agree. Let's move to the interior and talk about guys that we think are more or less kind of shoe-ins to start. We'll start with Josh Prebe. Is it Prebe or Prebe? Did we get that figured out?
It's Prebe.
Prebe. Gotcha. I thought we'd asked about that during spring ball, and it turns out we did. Yeah, he's a guy from Northwestern, grad transfer. I think a plug-and-play starter out of the portal for them, which is kind of been the MO 3 years in a row that they have gone to the portal to get a starter on the offensive line. Yeah, I mean, he's made team captain at Northwestern. He's made 29 career starts, I believe it is, all at left guard. It seems like they're going to just kind of keep him there because why switch it up at this point? He's comfortable there. It goes against what I said about pigeonholing guys in the lineup. But Another guy I think is just a steady veteran that I think you start him from day one. Sounds like he had a good spring too. Sharon Moore loves that guy. Talked about there was a situation where he was bleeding during practice and he just kept playing through it and had blood all over his jersey. Just kind of feels like a Michigan guy. Maybe understated, maybe not quite as much hype as obviously an Olu Timmy had or Drake Nugent had, but he's a starter. He will start at a guard spot.
Yeah, and I mean that story is pretty epic. With the split lip, he posted an Instagram of it, and it is kind of disgusting. But Sharon Moore, in typical football guy fashion, said that it was awesome. It was pretty gnarly, but yeah, that forced him to miss the spring game. We didn't get to watch him play in person at the Big House on April 20th. But like you said, he's played a ton of college football, so that's not a huge concern at all. He was third team All Big Ten last season. Like, this is a really, really good football player that Michigan was able to get. And he feels like being a team captain, being, a leader, somebody who has a lot of experience, has earned accolades already at a major conference level. He feels just like an Oluwatimi. He feels just like Ladarius Henderson last year too. He was a team captain as well. Drake Nugent was a team captain at Stanford. This just feels like the perfect fit for Michigan. He's a guy from Niles, Michigan, probably, if I had to guess, wanted a Michigan offer out of high school but didn't get it. Played against Carson Barnhart. Carson Barnhart had nothing but good things to say. He said in their conference down there near Paw Paw, Michigan, this was always the big kid that he had to go against once or twice a year. And so Josh Preeb has been somebody who's had a lot of success in college football. And again, it's just a great fit for Michigan. He's played in 36 career games. Trevor Keegan played in 44 in his career. So Josh Preeb is a guy that has already more experience now than Keegan did coming into last season. So it just tells you how much, he knows about the position. And yeah, left guard is a great spot for him.
Let's move to that other guard spot. And a guy that I think in a different set of circumstances last year probably starts at one of the guard spots. And Giovanni El Hadi just happened to turn out that Zach Zinter came back. Trevor Keegan came back. And it just kind of lent itself to him having to take a back seat. But I thought when we saw him during the 22 season, was it replacing? It was somewhat, was it Keegan on the offensive line that was injured? Clayton, you're our historian here. Was that who he replaced?
Yeah, and then there was a time when Ryan Hayes was out too, and then Keegan kicked out to left tackle.
That's right.
But yeah, I believe he started at left guard, right?
It was at left guard. So I think he probably slots into right guard in that center role. I think the one thing about him, and I know the PFF grades aren't superb, but I just felt like when he was in those, when he had extended run during that 22 season, I thought he looked fine. I thought he was a guy that played at a starting level. Just kind of turned out the way that things played out last year, that he was sort of on ice for one more year. I think when you look at a guy, you look at all these guys on this Michigan offensive line that could potentially be all Big Ten type of performers. He feels like a guy that has a chance to pop in a big way. I think based on what we saw, maybe slightly ahead of as a pass blocker, Michigan needs him to maybe get a little nastier in the run game. But to me, I don't have a lot of concerns about him in an expanded role because, quite frankly, it might be a season or two overdue.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing with him and Greg Crippen. Like, they easily could have started last year for Michigan, but, Zach Zinter decided to come back and Trevor Keegan decided to come back. And I think those guys are pretty happy with their decisions. But, it means that a guy like Giovanni El Hadi has to stick around and wait his turn. He didn't have to do that, though. He could have left and gone somewhere else and started. You don't get penalized anymore for transferring, but he decided to stick it out. And it speaks, to who he is as a player. I think that's really impressive because, he would have been a starter a lot of other places in the country. Same with Greg Crippen. And, now you're looking at a guy who is, has been developed by the best, Sharon Moore and the Michigan staff for years, who's going to be ready. So as Sharon said, when we talked to him in late May, he said, Trevor Keegan and Zach Zinter weren't going to be here for 10 years. Like, at some point, somebody else was going to have to step up. And in 2021, Trevor Keegan was a first-year starter. Like, this cycle, just because Michigan's had the same lineman, for the last few years, minus some transfers coming in, sometimes you forget that, some years it's going to be a new guy coming into a spot, taking it over, and, ending up maybe being better than the guy he replaced. Now, it's a little bit scary if you're a Michigan fan because you're doing that with all 5 positions. But like we said with Hinton and some other guys, Giovanni Al-Hadi's not a guy without experience. He's started 3 games. He's played in 30. So he knows what he's doing, and he is kind of a beast out there, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up on how we feel about him. I mean, I think I think pretty much everyone we've talked about so far is a mortal lock to start. Greg Crippen at center is interesting because by all accounts, again, maybe the guy that's been most affected by transfers over the last few years, when you bring in an Oluwatimi and you bring in a Drake Nugent last year. I remember during those Orange Bowl practices down in Florida that they were, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong because you were actually down there. You and Chris were down there, but I think there was a lot of Greg Crippen hype coming out of those bowl practices, and then 2 years in a row they come out and they take a transfer in the portal, and this is a guy too that I think is sort of been maybe a year or so overdue for an expanded role. Michigan sort of has done a great job bringing in guys. I'll put it this way: 3 years in a row, he's had great guys to learn from. Andrew Vistardis was, a leader and a tone setter in 21. Oluwatimi was the best center in college football in 22. Last year, Drake Nugent, maybe even somewhat underrated for how good he was for that Michigan offense. And now, he's in a similar mold to El-Hadi in terms of he's pretty well seasoned at this point in terms of knowing what it takes to be a college football player. The one thing I'll say here is every once in a blue moon, we start to hear hype on how Raheem Anderson looks like, the best offensive lineman in camp, and he could push for a spot at center. I think there's a little bit of competition that'll be there at the center position, maybe more so than those other spots in the interior. But overall, I mean, it feels like Greg Crippen is kind of being talked about as a guy that's overdue for his opportunity, and they're pretty confident about what they have there in him.
Yeah, and he's a film room junkie, somebody who is in there all the time, and who Sharon Moore has said they would have trusted last year if they needed him to start. But I think this is, an indicator in how Sharon Moore approaches the transfer portal. Like, if you're able to go out and get somebody that's going to either add competition or be able to come in and start right away, they're going to do it. And if you're a competitor, you're going to respect that. And I think Greg Crippen has, because he has stayed here as well. He's continued to compete. He was ready to come in against Iowa in the Big Ten championship game, and did for a few snaps as well when Drake Nugent went down, against a fantastic defense that really held Michigan to very limited yardage and a bunch of field goal attempts in that game, despite it being a Michigan shutout. It was kind of a struggle there on offense, but Greg Crippen's able to hold his own. They trust him to go in there. I think Raheem Anderson is a guy that's going to continue to compete. But yeah, I would put Greg Crippen as the favorite there. They seem to really like him. And you're talking about somebody who, the guys he played behind the last 2 years, one of them won the Remington and the Outland trophies. The Outland trophy going to the best interior lineman, regardless of the side of the ball, in college football. And last year, Drake Nugent being a finalist for that award and a first team all Big Ten player. So it just speaks to, like, when we bring up the point about Jack Tuttle, where the guys he backed up were Michael Penix Jr. and JJ McCarthy, it's kind of the same thing when you're looking at Greg Crippen. He's been able to learn from those guys. Center position is very important, not only chemistry with the quarterback, but also communication and chemistry with the entire offensive line. So, you hope that develops overall, because the biggest thing about these Sharon Moore coached offensive lines, and now Grant Newsome, kind of his protege, coaching it along with Sharon Moore being the head coach, is that they just operate as one. They're not 5 individuals out there. And Nick Saban called them the best coach offensive line in the country last season. He saw them up close and personal on New Year's Day. But they just do operate as kind of one unit. And a lot of that can be attributed to the center making the right calls, having everybody on the same page. So it's going to be important that Greg Crippen is in the same mold as Nugent and Oluwatimi in that regard. But by all accounts, he is, because of the level of preparation and the standard he holds himself to as a guy who's always in the film room and, you know, has been here for a long time and understands the system.
You know, it's kind of interesting when we do this exercise and you run down all of these positions, you know, from the left to right side. And like we opened with, you know, the narrative is that, oh, well, Michigan has offensive line question marks. And yeah, there are some questions about who's going to step into what and how big of a leap are some of these guys going to take. But once you kind of sit here and talk about it, it feels like they're in relatively good shape compared to what most teams that flip their entire offensive lines would have to do. And, you know, if that's seen as spin, if it's seen as, you know, what have you, so be it. But it just kind of feels like one of the benefits to the last few years. And, you know, there is no better benefit than game experience and legitimate game experience. And this group's going to get that early on. I could see them being a group that starts out a bit shaky and gets better as the year goes on because of the caliber of teams they play right off the bat. But I go into this offseason feeling pretty decent in terms of, you know, at least if you had to power rank questions you have on this football team, I don't know that the offensive line would be like in my top 3 or 4 of those things. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's probably right on the edge after, you know, 3 or 4 questions, and it's because of what you lose. It's because Sharon Moore is no longer the position coach. But I do tend to trust that Sharon Moore is going to have offensive lines. They're going to play really well, and they're going to play together and fundamentally sound, know their assignment, just because that's kind of his MO. And when you thought about Sharon Moore getting promoted from offensive line coach to not just offensive line coach, offensive coordinator, co-offensive coordinator in 2022. Then it's last year, he's running the entire offense all by himself, of course, with assistance of the other coaches on that side of the ball. But you still added things to his plate, and the offensive line continued to produce at a really high level. So I imagine it'll be very similar. I asked Sharon Moore, you know, how much confidence he has in Grant Newsome. And of course, he's not going to say anything else, but he said that Grant is beyond ready for this opportunity to coach those guys. And, you know, I just tend to believe they'll have a pretty good offensive line. I do wonder about protection on the outside at the tackle spots, protecting the quarterback. Depending on who wins the quarterback job, Michigan's going to have, you know, could have different levels of mobility back there. Because you know, the protection was a little spotty at times last year from the tackle spots, but JJ McCarthy was so good at sensing it, or even checking out of something before the play, or getting out of trouble when he needed to as well. So hopefully these other quarterbacks, you know, have the same feel for the game. It's gonna be tough for that to be the case, but it all plays into each other. You know, you even have a new running back there. I know Donovan Edwards played a lot on third down, but the running back blitz pickups, that sort of thing, they all work together, and they're going to have to be on the same page.
It just feels like, you know, Jim Harbaugh teams are always, you could always bank on the fact that a Jim Harbaugh team was going to have a hell of a good tight end, and they were going to utilize it. And it feels like a Sharon Moore football. And Michigan's still going to have that. Don't get me wrong. They might have the best tight end in college football this year. But I feel like a Sharon Moore football team is always going to have good offensive line, good backs. And that goes hand in hand with what they've been.
And he has been a tight ends coach too. So
that is true. So, and it all segues into what is now Steve Kasula's position group, the Michigan tight ends. We will run down everyone in that room next here on our show. Starting with a guy who, I think he is the epitome of a tone-setting player, of a Swiss Army knife that is just going to do whatever the hell it takes for this football team, and that's Max Bredesen. Technically a fullback in the tight end room, going to have him play some tight end. He'll play some H-back, but Max Bredesen is a guy who I would say there's probably an outside shot that he's a captain on this team. I think that, you know, we just talked about, was it the last show that you and I did about how some of these guys, you know, we were talking about, I think Eli Owens is a name that came up down the road, talking about how important those type of guys can be to a physical football team. And Max Bredesen is a guy that, listen, when you go back and you watch the highlight films from the 2023 season films. Wow, that's an old school term. It's all on YouTube now. No one's putting a tape. No one's rolling out the TV cart and put the tape in. Oh, maybe you are at this point, but unless you're a nerd like us, I say that lovingly, you're not really going to notice the Max Bredesen plays, but what he does for this football team is as important as a lot of other guys that are maybe a little bit under the radar.
Yeah, I'm definitely a nerd because it felt like every big run Michigan had last year included, whether it was a block from AJ Barner or Colston Loveland, but a lot of them had a huge block from Max Bredesen or at least one of the tight ends. And he plays a key role. And it's really like, it feels like he's so good at that role that over the last 2 years, and especially last season, they've kind of started to run more H-back sets because he's so good at it. So he is a really, really integral part of what Michigan's going to do offensively. And I'm glad we were talking about this today because I'm writing about this today and was transcribing what Sharon Moore said in a talk at an online coaches clinic where he shared some data from Michigan's season last year. They were 100% efficient in short yardage with a fullback last year. That was, of course, Max Bredesen. 85% efficient on the goal line with a fullback from 1 to 3 yards. He said it feels like using a fullback or an H-back establishes a mentality. He said, especially with the guy we have doing it, which is Max Bredesen. And one of the big things is establishing that mentality. And he said, every team has the different values and, things that they like to do or style. But for us, it's, physicality, and it is using an H-back, a fullback. He can obviously line up in line as well. So he brings a ton to this offense. And I meant to say this on Thursday when we were talking about the EA Sports ratings and Ohio State's defense and Caleb Downs being one of the top players in the country. You see that he is taking reps at running back this spring, or did this past spring. That was a report out of Columbus. I think Max Bredesen may have scared him to the offensive side of the ball because he had some pretty gnarly blocks on Caleb Downs in the Rose Bowl. And one of them was a penalty. I thought it was kind of BS, but at the end of the day, I loved it. He jumped right on top of that dude. He pancaked him, jumped on top, let him know who's boss. And then, on Blake Corum's run in overtime, I believe it was, he had another great block on Caleb Downs as well. So this is a guy who is just you don't want to see 44 running at you if you're playing defense.
Absolutely not. I think it's pretty telling about how he feels about his role. When we talked to him during spring ball, standard run-of-the-mill press setting, and I asked him, like, how, when your head coach's mentality is to smash and you're maybe the key lieutenant in that regard, how does that feel? And, he had his face lit up. He smiled, grinned as big as one can, and more or less said, it's kind of an honor. I think the world of that guy, and Michigan fans should give that guy some more love because he was a huge part of your success last year. I think he's going to be a big part of it this year as well. Let's move into the junior class now with Colston Loveland. There are a lot of question marks about this passing game heading into the year because of the quarterback situation. But whoever wins this job, whether it's Tuttle, whether it's Alex Orji, whether it's Davis Warren, Colston Loveland is going to be that guy's best friend. Most draft people heading into next year's class have him as a first-round caliber prospect. I think the last time I checked, PFF had him somewhere in the top 16, 17, whatever it was, and leading the way among tight ends. I mean, with Brock Bowers out of Georgia now, I think you can make a legitimate case that Loveland could be the best tight end in college football. And that might not come with the gaudiest numbers just because of what the Michigan offense is. But, he's put a pretty 2 strong years on film. And really at this point, I think you're just looking at him to sharpen everything that's in his toolkit because it's all there. The size, the athleticism. I think he has gotten better as a blocker. Still maybe not, the most well-rounded that you could be there. But, he's a matchup tight end. He can play in line, but he's a movable piece. And I think he's a guy that really has a chance to be the straw that stirs the drink when it comes to what this offense, what this passing game can look like.
Yeah, and it goes back to the point that Michigan uses a lot of different tight ends, so it's not like he's the only one on the field and is only tasked with blocking. He has a bigger role. And last year, in terms of his snaps in line as a tight end and everywhere else, whether it was the backfield, the slot, or out wide, it was about equal between in line and all the other things. So he moves around a lot. They used multiple tight ends last year on 58.3 of their offensive snaps. We know that they just love to get in big personnel groupings and smash, as you said, with the Sharon Moore's mantra. And Jim Harbaugh loved how Sharon Moore called games like that, and it's going to continue, I would imagine, with Kirk Campbell. And you play to your strengths too. I think they have a lot in this tight end room. It obviously starts with Colston Loveland, but you do have guys like Max Bredesen where you line up multiple of those guys at the same time, and you can do both. You can run out of those formations, you can pass out of those formations. But Colston Loveland, definitely his best trait is as a receiver. 6'5", 245 pounds, very fast, very has that explosion where when he catches the ball and he turns and he needs to get 3-4 yards for a first down, like he has that burst that you need to get that, which is huge and does kind of remind you a little bit of Brock Bowers. There's something about Brock Bowers that's a little different, but when he turns and tries to get that first down. But I think this is somebody who's going to have another huge year. Last season was already fantastic. He had the most receiving yards from a Michigan tight end in a season, 649, since Jake Butt had 654 in 2015. And he'll probably be, or definitely be, even more of a focal point within this offense. If you don't have this high-level quarterback play, some of the plays might need to be a dump down to your tight end, and Colston Loveland is as reliable as they get.
Excited to see how much better he can get, because I think there is some more to unlock there. And when you hear, it's pretty affirming when you hear draft people talk him up the way that they have. So excited to see what he'll be able to do. A guy in his class who has been maybe the biggest riser of the offseason, maybe on the offensive side of the ball, is Marlon Klein, who has a chance to slide into that AJ Barner or Luke Schoonmaker type of role as the, if you want to call it 1B, fine. I think in this situation with Loveland, you're definitely more of a number 2. But Steve Kasula referred to him as a starting level player, a guy that they essentially see as a starter moving forward. A bit raw, needs some more game experience. But even Colston Loveland said, this is a direct quote from Colston Loveland I just pulled up. He said, Marlon is the fastest tight end, probably the strongest tight end, the biggest tight end. So he's got it all there. He's done a great job this spring of taking that next step, actually starting with real playing time. And he's embraced it and done a damn good job of practice. Obviously, AJ Barner was one really good inline blocking tight end. Not saying Marlon can't do that. He definitely can. But basically, with what we've talked about, the way that they were going to run and play offense, you're going to see a hell of a lot of Marlon Klein this year too.
Yeah, I think so. And it's going to be interesting because AJ Barner was one of the more underrated players on this team, along with Max Bredesen, and especially on the offensive side of the ball. And he was such a beast blocking. Like when you say that most of those big runs had a big block from Max Bredesen, a lot of them also had a big block from AJ Barner. So he does have big shoes to fill. Your number 1 tight end in Colston Loveland isn't as good of a blocker, so you're going to have to be really good in that area. But I also think he's going to be able to catch the football too. It'll be interesting to see. Yeah, I mean, he definitely is one of the guys that broke out in the spring. He is newer to football, being from Germany, so like you said, he doesn't have as much experience, but he was a pretty dynamic player in high school when they were getting him the football. Played some wide receiver and things like that. So I think that there might be, maybe he's not as much of a beast as AJ Barner. And I think AJ Barner could have also caught the ball more and showed off his skill set there than he did last season, but it just kind of turned out a certain way. But maybe Marlon Klein will get those opportunities AJ Barner didn't, and he'll have an impact that way as well.
Let's move on to the sophomore class, which I think has a couple of interesting guys in it. I think one of the more understated subplots of this year will be, and it's like that's at multiple positions, but we'll focus on it at tight end for the purposes of this show, is kind of like figuring out behind the scenes what your pecking order is for, heading into next year, heading into spring ball 2025. Zach Marshall is a guy who, his progress has been behind the scenes. He's one of those playbook junkies, film junkies. I think he's really taken to learning his craft, learning how to prepare. He was, basically spent his freshman season in Chris Jenkins' hip pocket, which is not a bad place to be at all, despite the fact that Jenkins was at another position. But I think you're seeing a guy who did most of his damage in high school playing wide receiver, and then his senior year switches to tight end and then starts, learning his craft there. And certainly, was a Jim Harbaugh favorite as well. Deacon Tonielli is also in that mix as a guy that could compete for, let's say, tight end 3, 4, 5. I think things are a bit fluid there, but during the spring game, he showed that he belonged to in a 35-yard catch. And on that play, showed a little more speed than I think we thought he might have had to. So, when you look at that tight end 4 role, whatever that looks like or whatever shape that takes, I think those two guys are going to have something to say about it.
Yeah, and both guys redshirted last year. I think that's pretty common for tight ends because, like you said, a lot of them do play receiver in high school, so it's a little bit of an adjustment. Even Eric All, who turned out to be a great blocker, had to shift his mentality. And I remember him talking about, okay, once he did shift his mentality, like, all right, I'm in here, I'm blocking huge guys, up front. There were times he didn't know where the hell he was going. You have to learn the playbook too, and Michigan's is really complex, including in the run game. It's very complex. So it takes a lot. It takes a really, really special player and developed and ready player to play right away. Colston Loveland got to do that, especially towards the tail end of his freshman year. But these guys waited a year. Deacon Tonelli seems like he's ahead of Zach Marshall at this point. Sharon Moore said after spring ball that he is competing for that 4th tight end spot behind, Colston Loveland, Max Bredesen, and Marlon Klein. So I think we could see him play a little bit, depending on what happens, at least be a guy that's ready to go if they have an injury there, which is certainly possible at any point. And then Zach Marshall might be, a guy that could provide some snaps there as well if they need him too. But Deacon Tonelli really, really intrigues me. I know we've talked about him, going back to spring ball, but Jim Harbaugh said he's damn near identical to Colston Loveland. You can kind of see a little bit more of that wiggle to him than maybe some of the other tight ends. So I think that he's somebody down the road that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, and when we talk about down the road, I think we just round it out with the freshmen here, Brady Prescore and Hogan Hansen. I believe both early enrolled. That sounds right. A couple guys that were, I think, about the same size, 6'5", 230. I think for all the reasons that you laid out above, the fact that Michigan's playbook is so complex, the fact that there is a bit of an adjustment period unless you are a unicorn a la Jake Butt or a la Colston Loveland. I think that those guys are probably it's one of those maybe redshirt and check in next year type of things. But Prescorn was the in-state guy that Michigan liked quite a bit. Top 150 recruit. Hogan Hansen was a 4-star guy. So again, I think that you've got some good pieces here, certainly in the now with what you have. But again, that subplot of these guys, that kind of slow burn and percolate a bit behind the scenes. It feels like, I'd be interested, maybe I'll revisit it at some point this summer, but maybe what the future power rankings at each position group look like. Feels like the tight ends are in a good spot.
Yeah, I think it was a really good duo of freshmen that they were able to bring in. I would bet on both redshirting, but you can't rule it out. And maybe late in the year, Brady Prescorn earns a role and makes a few big plays, kind of like a Colston Loveland did a few years ago. Or maybe that's Hogan Hansen. I like Prescorn a lot. He is very big. He's another guy. I went and watched him. I saw him live play against West Bloomfield last season, and he was split out a lot. They were getting him the ball out wide in space, and there was no reason why they wouldn't do that, based on how good he was relative to the high school competition. But it will be a little bit of an adjustment. I think he's going to be really good. His brother is a fantastic player for Ole Miss as well. All SEC player. I think preseason All-American. So he's got the he's got the chops there. And I think Brady Prescorn is somebody that I would put on the list of wouldn't surprise me if he had a role this year, but wouldn't necessarily bet on it because I don't with most freshmen. But he's definitely in that category to me.
Well, and folks, remember too, you can play in 4 games, and I think even with the expanded playoff now, that restriction does not apply in the postseason. So I think it's possible one of those guys earns a role late. Yeah, like what we see in the tight end room. If you're able to go out and land, Andrew Olesh, which Michigan leads for him on the on-3 RPM, I believe a top 100 or on that fringe of being a top 100 recruit. That's a group you feel pretty good about moving forward. So, any other thoughts on the position groups that we've discussed today?
Not really. I just think there's so much talent. They've done a good job recruiting despite having turnover at the position coach spot. And now Steve Kasula seems like he's going out and getting some really good ones. Michigan could add another really good one in Andrew Olesh next week if he makes his commitment. Obviously battling Alabama, Florida for him, but they're looking really, they just have stockpiled a lot of talent in that room. They're looking good.
Well, what do you say move to questions then? We get a lot of great ones this week. Again, use that promo code UM1 for 2 months of access for $1. That gets you in to our message board and gets you into consideration for the questions we take each week here. Why don't you get us started, Clay?
EJ Holland, our coworker, asked, which staff member do you trust the most to drive the group to an away game this year? Who do you trust the least? I will say, you're here, the others aren't, so I'm inclined to say that I would trust you the most, just to avoid confrontation. And I think it might be true.
I will get us where we need to go safely. I will miss an exit at some point or some
tradition.
kind of on-ramp.
It's tradition.
At this point, am I doing it on purpose? Is it a bit that I've created? You guys will never know.
It could be.
Then again, who's to say? No, it's entirely due to ADD.
John Borton has a lead foot. I will say that.
Yeah, no disrespect to John Borton, but I have heard that he is quite the aggressive driver. In fact, when we were driving in, the 3 of us were driving in to the Iowa game, and I think I drove the rental car in, and I kind of made a move at the last second to kind of get into a turn lane or whatever. And Chris told me that was a John Borton type of move. So I think that says it all.
He did get us safe to, I know you weren't there, but to State College this year. Harbaugh's getting suspended. Chris Ballas and I are writing articles furiously and whatever, trying to get service on the hot spot in the middle of the mountains of Pennsylvania. And we were flying. Like, I barely looked up because I was so busy. We were absolutely flying, but he got us there. That's all that matters. We've been able to hit every game, so it's worked out.
Yeah, I trust everyone, but it's more of a power ranking of who will make us the less car sick.
That's fair. That is true. This one's from Braden Hudson. He said, if Orji is able to win this quarterback job, what does a successful season statistically look like in your eyes? I have faith, but it is really hard for me to wrap my head around what this offense looks like when it's working properly. Is it 2,000 passing yards and another 600 rushing? Do we see him as someone who can get to 1,000 rushing but won't throw for more than 1,500 yards? There's also another layer where you have Campbell and the offensive staff talk about how they would throw the ball more and spread it out if they had the talent for it. But this does not feel like the right personnel. I think Campbell's been pretty open that they're going to tailor the offense to what their players do well. It is a little bit concerning going into fall camp, not knowing exactly when you're going to know who your quarterback is, and then how much time you have, I guess, to tailor the offense to your players. But it's hard to say for an Alex Orji what a good stat line would be. I don't think he would throw for 3,000 yards, but you also may play in 17 games. So I wouldn't rule anything out in terms of totals. When you're looking at per game, I think you would hope that it'd be somewhere north of 200 passing yards and somewhere around 60 to 90 rushing yards. I mean, he's a really dynamic athlete, so you want to be able to use that. We've talked about this. He's durable. He can sustain hits, but at the same time, you want to protect him to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think he's probably more of a 600 rushing yard guy than he is a 1,000 yard rushing guy. I think that anyone who thinks that he's gonna put on the shoulder pads and the helmet and just throw it back to what Denard Robinson was, I don't believe that, because I do think that they want to keep whoever wins this job still needs to operate in structure of the offense. Now they'll tinker and based on the skill set of whoever is back there, but I think the biggest difference is that I feel like the last 4 or 5 years, really namely the last 2 years with JJ, Michigan fans, there'd be like a play call where it looks like it might be a run pass option, but it's really not. And they point at the screen like, oh, if he kept that, that's a touchdown. I think maybe that is a keep play at some point, a couple, with Orgy back there, but I don't think that they're just gonna run him like crazy. And I think that whoever wins this job has to be able to run the passing game the way that it has been run, with some tweaks in there, right? So to me, I think it's probably closer to 600 than it is 1,000, but I'd be happy to eat my words too, because I think it could be a lot of fun if you just kind of took the reins off the guy. But not that there are any, but you get what I mean. So yeah, it's hard to predict a stat line, but I think a big win. I'll just say this: if you can get Alex Orgy to complete 60% of his passes, which really it's accurate, but it's not that accurate, I think that would be a huge win for them, because I think it could set them up to do some other things really well.
Yeah, it'd be interesting what that 60 looks like, what the yards per attempt are. I think might maybe even be more important, because if we're looking at 60% and they're not throwing much, it's a lot of dink and dunk type of stuff, I think it would limit the offense. I think Kirk Campbell has said they like right around 67% completion. But if it is a different offense, to your point, where you are running him more and you're getting efficiency that way, there could be a scenario where 60 is fine. So yeah, it's hard to predict stats. I know we get those a lot. It's just really hard to do. And I would have predicted JJ would have thrown for more yards last year if they played 15 games before the season. I probably did on here. But then he threw for what he threw for, which was still good enough to win them the national championship. Hail to your Victor wonders, this year, would you rather make the Final Four and lose in football, or the Final Four and lose in basketball? And I think this is a great question. I think it's one you have to preface by saying some people are football fans 10 out of 10, and they're more 7 out of 10 basketball. Some are the opposite, obviously, 10 out of 10 basketball, 7 out of 10 football. So if you're one of those, like, you just pick the sport you care more about. But I did think quite a bit about this, where to me in football, if you make the Final Four, that tells us a lot about what Sharon Moore and this staff can do. And it is harder probably to make the Final Four now, because it assumes you may have to win a couple games in the college football playoff to do that. Or, or you got to by winning the Big Ten championship and then won a quarterfinal game, which would be really impressive, because it means you had a fantastic regular season. Then you went on to have success in the postseason. In basketball, there's a little more luck involved. You get a break here, break there, and there's so much roster turnover that I don't think it's going to matter as much in terms of what they're building towards the future. I will say I would take a Final Four in either, but to me, I would feel better about things if it were football that made it. But it's a tough call.
I did not see this question ahead of time. So this is me completely going off the cuff with it, which is scary to a lot of people. When I get off script, I realize that. Dusty May is a good example of this, because I think if Michigan were to make the Final Four in basketball, you're like, holy crap! Like, we hit a home run. We have one of the best coaches in the sport. Like, that is higher affirming. That is just so big in so many ways. On the same token, the fact that Dusty May did make a Final Four with Florida Atlantic, and listen, I think that's legitimate, but the path there being what it was, Purdue loses to a 16 seed, opening up a world of possibilities for you. I don't think you can luck into a Final Four appearance in football. I think that is entirely earned. And I think in this 12-team playoff, that is going to be more earned than it ever has been. So,
and you could luck into a loss in basketball, second round, first round. You know what I mean?
exactly. Everything about making the Final Four in the college football playoff is as earned as it can possibly be. Like when you throw, and again, like you have to play the games, right? You roll the basketball out there and you could miss a three at the buzzer. You could hit a three at the buzzer to win the game. Like it can be that thin a margin of error. Whereas, Michigan football played, at least from a special teams perspective, one of the worst games you can possibly play on the biggest stage imaginable, and still found a way to win because they were just because they were that good. I think it's football. For me, it's football. It's a long-winded way of me saying it's football.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. Again, it's so personal. Like it's such a personal decision.
Yeah.
Those are where we stand. Please comment in the chat if you have a take on it as well. Would love to see some of those from Michigan fans because it is interesting. You're entering year one of new coaches for both programs. Sasquatch 616 with one of the best questions we've ever gotten. I mean that sincerely. If you could choose to attend any Michigan sporting event from the past that you were unable to attend when it actually happened, what would it be? So this is either before your time or something you just didn't go to during your lifetime, or you were too young, or whatever it was. It's just such a good question. I can't say enough how good it is. I mean, to me, the first thing that came to mind was the 1969 Michigan-Ohio State game. You win 12-10. That kicked off 35, 40 years of Michigan being an elite program under Bo Schembechler, and then later on his predecessors or successors, excuse me. The 1997 Michigan-Ohio State game has to be up there. But I will say it is wild to say this, but we have also been to, luckily, and we're blessed to be able to say
brag.
We've been to a lot of these games that people would love to go to, and we're just so blessed for it in this job, to be there at the Rose Bowl and things like that, Michigan-Ohio State games in Columbus in 22. But 69 Ohio State has to take the cake for me, I think.
Yeah. I suspect this will change this season, but again, it's a stat that still blows my mind to this day. I haven't seen Michigan football lose a game in person since they lost to Alabama in the Citrus Bowl.
That's right.
Through circumstance, that's the way it's gone down. Now, I suspect that will not be a streak that continues throughout the entirety of the 2024 campaign. We'll see. I don't know. No man knows the future. I've never been to an NCAA tournament game. And when I think about the one I would have most wanted to be at, it's the Trey Burke, Kansas game. To me, that's when you think about the emotions that go into that. Now, again, I realize that like the game that followed where you just beat the piss out of Florida on Easter Sunday would have been a lot of fun. Those Final Four games would have been fun. But to see a moment like that, it would be. And maybe the fact that it's not one of those national title games or Final Fours, whatever it is, just that's like maybe the most iconic moment in Michigan basketball history, right? Like, is that a hot take? It's got to be up there.
No, I don't think it's a hot take. I mean, other than the Ramil Robinson free throws, right?
Yeah.
And it was so big to make the Final Four and national championship game that year. To really,
the fact that it's Kansas, and
you were down 14.
The Trey Burke game. Yeah, that's
I love it.
I can say this too. Like, if you're there as a fan, if I was there as a fan, you're just absolutely like, you're like 4 minutes left in the game. You're just like, this sucks. This is terrible. I came all the way to Dallas, and for what? And then I think it's the emotional swing late in that game that makes that the one that I would have liked to be at.
And they took advantage by going on an even deeper run. Like, they didn't just win that game and lose the next, 2 days later, which was awesome.
Yeah.
Great answer. DJ Wolverine, he's been a great question asker the last several weeks. He says, besides the obvious tough games of Texas, USC, at Washington, Oregon, and at Ohio State. Which other game could Michigan have a tough time in being victorious? We've talked about this. Minnesota, to me, is my trap game on this Michigan schedule. It's between USC and Washington. They should have, they have a ton returning on defense. They should be a good defensive team. Darius Taylor comes back at running back. They're going to have a pretty good run game. The offensive line has a lot of returning players and experience there, and a preseason All-American at tackle. So I think it's Minnesota, but Fresno in the opener, when you're trying to figure things out offensively, if Michigan doesn't know their starter until 10 days before that game, and at quarterback, I mean, then, maybe that could be a tough game just because you're trying to figure out what you are identity-wise. But I would point to Minnesota, but you never know about road trips, to Indiana. Those have gotten weird in the past too. So
I think the one I've mentioned the most this year is the Illinois game, because on the road, it's kind of a weird spot. I think they're coming off the bye week, right? Coming off a bye. They have Michigan State the next week. I don't think Illinois is going to be very good, but they do play a physical brand of football. And I think, they will. I think that's a game like a Brett Bielema team is going to be able to hold up in a fist fight. So to me, that's one where, again, I'm not sitting here predicting a loss. Like, that's a game Michigan still probably wins by 2 scores. But talk about tougher than you anticipate. I think that maybe fits the bill for me.
Yeah, if you come out flat off the bye, I think that's a fair one for sure. And let's see, last one from B Block. Who will be in the jumbo package? We are pretty sure who the starting 5 are: Hinton, El Hadi, Crippen, Preeb, and probably Gentry. But who is offensive lineman 6 and offensive lineman 7 when we really want to smash? Afobe, Percy, Link. Evan Link is the first guy that came to mind for me. So I would say it could be him. I mean, if Percy, I'll say this: I feel like if Gentry's the backup at right tackle, he has a better chance of being an offensive line or extra offensive lineman than Percy, just because I feel like you can move around. He's a little bit more mobile and athletic, and they seem to like a more mobile, athletic guy at that spot. Trente Jones was perfect for it. But I would say Evan Link is 6 and somebody else is 7. It's tough to say.
Yeah, I think that's going to be something to sort out. What a great question to end this show, though. The fact that it was offensive lineman, tight end. Perfectly done, perfectly placed by you. Yeah, I think Percy will be in the mix for that. We didn't even talk about Nate Afobe earlier. Like, he's maybe someone to keep an eye on a year from now or so. But, yeah, those are 2 good picks. I think I'll just double down and go with what you said. So, all right, well, that's going to do it for us today. Thank you guys for watching, following along. I know we're into the next 3 weeks or so. It's kind of the dead zone for a bit. So we're going to clean up some topics from the offseason, and we'll be heading to Indianapolis for Big Ten Media Days before you know it. So be sure to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel for more throughout the summer. The NCAA football, EA Sports College Football 25 is out 2 weeks from tomorrow. July 16th, the deluxe edition drops. We'll both have that. So going to do something with that in the lead up to the worldwide release on the 19th. We'll mess around with that game for a bit in the lead up to the season. So looking forward to that as well. Be sure to use that promo code UM1 to get 2 months of access for only $1 at thewolverine.com. The link to that is in the description below. Be sure to order our football preview magazine as well. For Clayton Safey, for producer Megan behind the scenes, I'm Anthony Broom. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you again next time.